Finishing off the Week 15 slate of games as we look through the remaining games. We obviously dived into a lot of them on the Monday edition of RotoViz Overtime as we talked through a number of different scenarios. Today we are going to look among the rest of those. Shawn, is there a game that you would like to dive into from the ones that we haven't talked? They all have some interesting notes, but there's none that is picking in my brain that we have to jump into that one.
Well, you had been kind of hinting that we might go with Eagles, Steelers, and this one I think was pretty interesting because you have an Eagles squad that has sensational numbers across the board, but have played a very easy schedule and had some warts, right? They come in with questions about the passing game. A.J. Brown, very frustrated with how some of those parts of the offense have worked over, certainly last week, but over the entire season. Really, you have this elite complement in DeVonta Smith, and they barely use him other than basically as a touchdown vulture from A.J. Brown. So certainly neither of them like that very much. They're going against a Steelers team that has dramatically overperformed, that has another one of these archetypal Steelers defenses that plays hard, that has really limited mistakes, that has evidently benefited from Russell Wilson's ability. Is this veteran savvy, Colm? We got the craftiness from Russell Wilson, which usually takes the shape of tossing some very soft, deep sideline passes that honestly have been extremely accurate, have allowed him to move the ball down the field. But you have an offense that should be overmatched against this Eagles defense if the Eagles defense is not a fraud, which is certainly something I think is still an open question, especially when they don't have George Pickens. You know, which team was going to be exposed here in this Battle of Pennsylvania? Jalen Hurts made a bit of a statement. It's one of these games, these performances, these results, a little bit like I believe is probably the case with your Packers, where you wonder why it takes people getting really frustrated and going to the media and saying, look, we need to have a full team that's a well-rounded squad if we want to be a true Super Bowl contender, if we want to match up with the greats. Now, a little bit of what happens here is that the Steelers take out Saquon Barkley, and then as a result, you're going to have to throw the ball if you want to score and win. But to see A.J. Brown go for 8, 110, and 1, to see DeVonta Smith go for 11, 109, and 1, combined for 23 targets out of the 32 passing attempts immediately after a situation where the team is frustrated by Jalen Hurts' inability to throw the ball and their offensive coordinator's inability to dial up any successful passing plays. And this felt too easy, really, didn't it?
This feels like, I don't know, it's like not Jekyll and Hyde, but they have a certain amount of ways they can play the game, and they have been leaning so heavily on the run that they have basically cancelled a lot of their passing game. And this was a game where they, whether it was game planned or situation during the game, where they decided we're going to do it through the air. And I talked on a few shows recently where A.J. Brown, like on multiple passing plays, looks like he's open at will, but Jalen Hurts is either not pulling the trigger or he's going in a different direction, playing a little bit more conservatively. This was a game where I felt like they were a lot more aggressive and just going with the pass. Like he's 25 of 32 for 290 and two passing touchdowns. I thought Jalen Hurts looked absolutely fantastic in this one. You already mentioned the totals for Brown and for Smith, but they looked great as well. And they had a combined 42 attempts rushing for 131 yards, and then a tush-push touchdown, 45 of those yards going the way of Jalen Hurts. So I'm going to put some of that rushing, the 19 carries for Barkley for just the 65 yards on a very strong Steelers defense. But I thought when the game plan had to be switched up and to go to the pass, it looked really... You mentioned the phrase easy. I thought it looked very efficient, and I would be saying a bit like when I'm criticizing the Packers for some of the stuff they're doing. I think that the Eagles should be leaning more heavily into some of these strengths of both their star wide receivers. And, it's clear here in the game like this that Hurts can make those passes when necessary. On the other side, Shawn, this game was so much more closer than it should have been. We're heading into halftime. We get a situation where Hurts is fighting for a first down on third down. Early in this one, TJ Watt forces a fumble. The Steelers recover. The Steelers go 3 and out. They punt it away. It's a fumbled return. They settle in, obviously, for a field goal there. We get A.J. Brown's touchdown. We get some nice plays for Kenneth Gainwell as we're moving along. But the Steelers had no offense. They had minus 19 yards on the first 3 drives of this game, Shawn. Then they get the touchdown to Pat Freiermuth. I thought it was an extremely good play by Freiermuth. Strong hands at the catch point. It really could have been an interception. He holds on to it, gets the touchdown there. Then we get a late 49-yard Boswell field goal in the second quarter. This game is 4 points in it at the half, and a game that the Eagles had just dominated throughout. So I thought that the Steelers were lucky to keep it as close as it was at halftime. I thought the Eagles should have won this even more comfortably. The Steelers don't score in the second half. I thought the offense looked completely broken without having Pickens in there. I know I would probably say I think it's broken with him in there as well. It's just that he's making good plays. But there's a 31-yard completion to Calvin Austin this, Shawn. But outside of that, the longest play for the Steelers is 17 yards to Ben Skoranek. They have a 15-yard to Mike Williams. They have 12-yard to Pat Freiermuth. There's no explosion in this. The run game, they have 17 carries for 56 yards. One of those being a Justin Fields scramble where he scrambles for a first down and 8 yards and also gets a penalty flag that gains them another 15 yards as he's hit on the slide. So there's just nothing really happening in the offense, and the Eagles get the result. So there's probably a lot of similarities in the way the Packers and the Seahawks went and this game went, where the scoreline could have been much broader as we kind of entered that fourth quarter.
Now, again, I do want to note that the Eagles' schedule has been incredibly easy, but you look at their advanced stats, you look at Blair's wrong read article going into week 15, and you won't find too many games where the stats give you such a clear view of what's going to happen. This Eagles defense is maybe one of the best tackling squads that we've ever seen, right? They were second best in the entire NFL in yards after the catch over expected. They were the best in terms of yards per passing play. They were the best in EPA allowed per rush. And they do that despite playing the lightest boxes in the entire NFL. So if you're talking about a recipe for completely and utterly dominating an opposing offense, the Eagles have all of those things in place, and that's how you have all of these drives that never get started, that never gain any yards. The answer that we did get coming out of this game is that Pittsburgh has a lot of work to do. They are one of these teams that generally wins by playing hard and being competent, whereas the Eagles have the potential to be one of these teams that annihilates the competition and is right back where they were a couple of years ago, where they were just moments away, really, certainly minutes away from winning the Super Bowl against the Kansas City Chiefs. This Eagles team, when you think about how their defense is playing, you think about the big playability from Saquon Barkley, it's not going to come out every single game, right? And this is a game where he has 19 for 65, and that included a 22-yard run. But you have Barkley, and it's really the big play that makes the difference in the running game. He gives you that. And then, I mean, everybody knows about A.J. Brown, but I think DeVonta Smith is one of the certainly one of the 5 most underrated receivers in the entire NFL. And then you have the efficiency that Jalen Hurts brings on third and fourth and short, the efficiency around the goal line. The Eagles, especially when you consider the injuries that the Detroit Lions have had on defense, this does now look like the best team in the NFC, probably the best team in the NFL. And I say that having kind of worked through this game, subsequent to, discussing how Detroit, even in the loss, probably deserved to still be considered the best team in the NFL. I think the Lions and the Eagles right now are up there among some of the better teams that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years. Certainly with the Chiefs not being particularly interesting, the Bills and the Ravens being so explosive but so inconsistent. I think you've got to give the Eagles a lot of credit here at the top of the NFL, but mostly what we're thinking is it makes for a fantastic finish to the regular season, and then I'm getting more and more excited about the 2024 postseason.
Yeah, we are right up against it now. A lot of teams are obviously locked into their situation. This was a game where the Steelers lost, but still clinched their spot for the playoffs with the outcome of some of the other results in the AFC. Another team, Shawn, that ended up clinching their division this week, and obviously their spot then as a result in the playoffs, was the Houston Texans. A game where it felt like before it, me and you were going back and forth. I'm thinking this game is all set up to be a shootout if things go in the right direction. The things didn't go in the right direction, Shawn. This was a pretty boring game throughout. We had a number of different turnovers in it. We get 2 touchdowns to Nico Collins with just the 6 targets, 4 receptions for 17 yards. We get struggles on the Dolphins side for Tyreek Hill, 7 targets, 2 receptions, 36. It felt like every time that Hill was getting targeted, it was turning into an interception. Tua ended up with 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions, 196 yards. But like Washington led the way with 5 for 51 for Miami. Just trailed though by the 11 targets to Jonnu Smith for 9 for 48 and a touchdown. So there was nothing really explosive for either side in this. We got 12 carries for Achane, 12 for 41, 7 yards being the longest carry for him. Very unusual for the Dolphins not to have some explosive plays throughout the game. Malik Washington had a 20-yard reception. Tyreek Hill had a 21-yard reception. That was what led their direction. And then on the other side, we do get a long rush from Dara Ogunbowale for 35 yards, but that was the next closest being 15 by Tank Dell on a rush. And outside of that, Shawn, the longest pass play for TJ Stroud, he had 2 15-yard passes in this game that were complete. So nothing really happening. 2 touchdowns for Stroud, saving his day a little bit, but just 131 yards passing. Lots of things that could have went in a more positive direction. Jalen Waddle, I didn't mention there in the rundown. He got hurt in the second quarter, missed the rest of the game. We did get a heads-up play, I thought, by Achane in this, where Tua has a bad interception over the middle. At the end of the first half, they're kind of in field goal range. They're trying to work the clock to kick a field goal or get a touchdown before the half. It's returned to the 5-yard line of the Dolphins. So all the way back, and Devin Achane makes the save there to stop the touchdown, leads to a field goal. Didn't matter in the end, but it did make a 4-point save at that particular time entering the half. The one play, I guess, again on the Dolphin side, which didn't matter, they were trailing in this. They get a 4th down where they go for it in 4th and 2. A bit like I'm talking again with the Packers. And I thought it was a really good throw by Tua on this play, an incredible catch by Jonnu Smith at the back of the end zone for his touchdown. But overall, Shawn, this was a game where both teams just really struggled, and offensively, neither team were able to do much.
We got this division game here where the familiarity has probably caused some trouble for offenses. Ben has mentioned that a bit on stealing bananas. But the case that I made last week is that these Shanahan coaching staffs on the offensive side have been figured out. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be completely shut down in all games by any stretch, but you watched the catastrophe that was Thursday Night Football, and then you watch this game. Certainly the teams with that influence, when they play each other, they seem to have the defensive solutions. And then beyond that, for the Dolphins, they've just been so banged up at different points. Colm, was such a frustrating weekend from a redraft perspective, where you tried to play with some a conservative bent on a lot of these guys who came in injured, with the exception of needing to play Jalen Waddle on one of my most important teams, one of the ones that had a decent amount of upside for the sprint. He had some hamstring soreness during the week, but was considered to be ready. He puts up a 0. That's probably not a surprise. It's a little bit more almost a bait and switch there with these two strong games he'd had in the last three. Jalen Waddle, just not an impact player. He got the big extension this past offseason, and it certainly hurt them to have to lean on Malik Washington, but Washington looked okay. And so you have the 11 targets for Jonnu Smith. You mentioned what happened when they tried to target Tyreek Hill. It's going to be back to the drawing board for this Miami Dolphins team. But on the other side, CJ Stroud didn't look much better. Colm, 26 passes, only 131 passing yards. We had a good week in the first week of the sprint. I'm excited about the team that you and I have. We're a ways out, obviously, because of some of the huge performances that happened this past weekend that were not on our team, but we are in with a shot at it. You would like to be able to pivot from Drake May to this combination of CJ Stroud and the aforementioned Nico Collins with the 2 touchdowns. You'd like to think that Collins has the potential for some of the long gains that we've seen from him. His long in this one was 8 yards, right? If he breaks a 30-yard touchdown, a 50-yard touchdown, things that we've witnessed even just in plays that have been called back recently, then that gets both Collins and Stroud into an interesting area. We might be forced to do that sort of regardless. That would be our path to pulling back a huge number of points. But there's certainly nothing about this performance that would want to push you off of Drake May to Stroud, even though, as we already mentioned this week, the Patriots looked like one of the worst offenses in football. The biggest takeaway there.
2 touchdowns, Shawn, and this one to Nico Collins felt like it was Nico Collins and like, throw me the ball right now. It was more like the second touchdown, he runs right from the left-hand side of the end zone, runs along the back of the end zone. He's wide open most of this time. Then he runs to the front corner of the end zone. He's basically like, I'm open this whole time. Can I have the ball, please? Like, give me the ball now. I'll take the ball. And then it's a touchdown. And the other one, like, he breaks free as well, and a bit more of a scramble drill as well on that one. But I can't figure out what they're trying to do on this offense. Like, at least with the Packers offense, where we're being like very critical of the way they're using it, it's like, well, there may be some reason that the Texans just looks completely broken.
Yeah, CJ Stroud looks worse and worse every week. If you told me that Nico Collins was going to have 4 for 17 and 0 touchdowns next week, or 10 for 100 and 2 touchdowns next week, I would obviously pick the former. Really just a complete bailout that he scores any fantasy points at all in this game. It was a problem in that it led to Joe Mixon being eliminated also. I don't have a lot of hope for the Texans. And the other thing I would note is simply that this was probably much more a case of bad luck. And yet, in the aftermath of the Houston coaching staff and front office trying to wave away one of the dirtiest plays in NFL history for one of their defensive backs to then take someone's head off and send someone to the hospital in this game. Again, I mean, what is DeMeco Ryan still doing on an NFL sideline? I think this is grotesque.
Yeah, and we hope that the player, it seems like Grant Dubow's everything with it, moving in a positive direction from how it looked when the game was stopped and got stretchered out in this particular one. So hoping that he can make a full recovery there. Shawn, another player who picked up an injury, obviously less severe in terms of the impact at the time, but we'll see then what the impact is long-term for the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl aspirations. Patrick Mahomes hurts his ankle and this one, gets it taped up, is on the sideline. Carson Wentz sees the game out as the Chiefs really didn't have to do much late on to see off the Cleveland Browns. They are 13-1 on the year. The Browns now 3-11. Jameis Winston struggled mightily in this one. Took 5 sacks for 37 yards, 3 interceptions. Dorian Thompson-Robinson came in. He went 4 of 9 for 18 and interceptions. It didn't fare all that much better. The Chiefs quite strong on the ground in this one. 35 attempts, 132 total yards, 1 rushing touchdown. That rushing touchdown ends up being to Xavier Worthy. It was very close on the line of whether it was a pass or a rush based on when it was delivered out to him by Patrick Mahomes. Worthy also 6 for 46 on 11 targets, but the unfortunate part of that, the longest one being 12 yards. Very little explosive plays here for the Chiefs either. We get the long for DeAndre Hopkins, who had 6 targets, 5 receptions for 36, being 12 as well. Samaje Perine had 1 for 23, so that obviously means he had a 23-yard reception. Noah Gray had 15-yard long for Pacheco. Passing game quite limited throughout. We get 2 Patrick Mahomes passing touchdowns, 159 passing yards from him. The bright side, I guess, on the side for Cleveland, Shawn, Jerry Jeudy gets 108 yards and 11 receptions on 14 targets based on how the entire offense struggled throughout. We got a long 62-yard rushing touchdown for Jerome Ford, so he went 7 for 64 and a touchdown. Nick Chubb got hurt in this one. He also had a fumble during the game. There was just a lot of mishaps here by the Browns, which made it quite comfortable in the end for the Kansas City Chiefs outside of the injury to Mahomes. It was good to see Worthy lead the way in targets, but also there's a multitude of other ways that he could potentially be used. But we were starting to get into a case of, over the last couple of weeks, I was afraid he just had become a decoy on pretty much every single play. This was a week where on those plays, they looked to get him the ball.
Yeah, Worthy looked explosive here. He had another potential for a long touchdown that Patrick Mahomes missed. That was an interesting one where he did appear to be more or less triple covered, yet still open. And so it was unfortunate that pass was inaccurate. He also dropped a couple balls on the sidelines, which, especially the second one, Mahomes did not look particularly thrilled. That's not going to help him out. But the explosiveness that he demonstrated, he was a couple of shoelace tackles away from multiple additional big plays. You can look at that either way, right? On a couple of those, it's like he was on the verge of a massive game, or again, the doubters are going to say, well, that's what you get from someone who, weighs 115 pounds soaking wet. You're not going to be able to beat those guys. I thought that he should have been able to get more yardage on a couple of plays. Certainly, I thought, you got to be able to make those catches, but the volume situation is trending into a very positive direction, right? I think that Worthy still has the potential to be a massive blow-up guy in one of the last 2 weeks here. I do think he's someone who will probably be pretty undervalued next season. He's a first-round pick who has this type of speed in an offense that's going to be more dynamic. Yes, Rashee Rice should come in and should be the offensive focal point next year, and yet this is a team that's no longer really getting anything from Travis Kelce. It's a team where both of the backs, and Isaiah Pacheco 13 for 32, and this one is never a good sign when Kareem Hunt comes in and looks like the more dynamic player. Worthy and Rice just have so much potential to be exciting in the future. The real star of this game, though, in an under-the-radar type of way, was Jerry Jeudy, who continued to get open throughout, draws 14 targets. The next closest player on the team is Elijah Moore, who ended up with negative receiving yards. Right, for Jerry Jeudy to catch 11 passes for 108 yards in a game where Winston passed for 146 and Dorian Thompson-Robinson passed for 18, that is extraordinary. Jerome Ford also looked very, very good, sort of filling in for, not really filling in for, but as the change of pace back around Nick Chubb. Chubb made a couple of plays in this game as well, but Ford has, in a stealth type of fashion, had a very good season. He's put himself in a very positive place for his NFL career as it goes forward. The same obviously can't be said at the QB position. Maybe the most frustrating moment of this game was when Jameis Winston got benched. Now, you could certainly argue that the Browns didn't have any other choice. You can't throw the 3 picks. You can't take the 5 sacks. There's even a line of thought that this helps explain why Deshaun Watson has been so bad. That doesn't really hold up when you see how good Jerry Jeudy has been with basically anybody who is not Deshaun Watson, and how much of a afterthought or irrelevancy he was when Watson was back there. The baffling thing about the choice to bench Winston, and I guess I understand the fact that you have to have some accountability. You can't continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over. The Cleveland Browns defense, did hold in here. Patrick Mahomes, 4.2 yards per attempt. It's just absolutely crazy where the Chiefs offense is right now. To do that and to then be in a situation where you're making no progress because of all the mistakes by Winston. That part is tough. But Dorian Thompson-Robinson is basically just quitting, right? He doesn't give you any chance to move the ball, which is what you have to do when you're trailing. As somebody who has Jeudy on almost every single sprint roster on a huge number of best ball teams, Colm on the different dynasty things we're doing, I'm terrified that DTR is going to start this week and Jerry Jeudy quickly becomes unplayable again, which is tough. I mean, Jeudy has been going up against elite corners and making them look silly over the last month.
Yeah, he's looked fantastic. So we'll see what happens over the course of the week. Definitely, I think it's much better. I don't think it's anywhere remotely close in terms of the fantasy aspect to it. If we have Jameis Winston in there, I think Jameis Winston's an all-time fantasy quarterback, not an all-time NFL quarterback, but if we can get him in there as often as possible, I think it leads to fireworks. Moving on, Shawn, to the Buccaneers. There was some fireworks in this as they romp a win against the Chargers. They are both now 8-6 on the season. The Chargers, Shawn's been an interesting season. They go on a losing run in the middle of the season, and you kind of think, well, it's over for them. They had lost Godwin, Mike Evans was out injured, but they go on a winning run here where they got a win against the Giants, the Panthers, the Raiders. So you're thinking, yeah, they're moving along here, but it's not that exciting. But they head on up and they beat a Chargers team, which I think have been a tough out for pretty much anyone over the course of the season. Justin Herbert has 195 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception in this game. Taylor Heineke was in for 1 play. He passed it for 4 yards. They had absolutely no. The one thing about the Chargers, Shawn, they do not have a running game. 11 combined attempts for Gus Edwards and Vidal for just the 32 yards. Ladd McConkey starts this game off pretty hot, ends up with 5 for 58 and a touchdown on 7 targets. Quentin Johnson has 10 targets, 5 for 45 and a touchdown for him. Stone Smart was somebody who kind of came in against the Chiefs last week. He had 6 targets, 5 receptions for 50. So nothing outrageous across the board there. But on the other side, Shawn, looking for explosive plays, we have Bucky Irving, who had 15 for 117, one of those being a 54-yard rush. He came into this game obviously banged up, but did play, I'd say, kind of around the normal amount of the percentage of snaps that we would have expected. His running mate, Rashad White, 15 of 6 for 64, and he did fumble a snap, which looked to be at a key time of the game as they looked to get a first down, but in the end, it didn't count all that much. Shawn, the talking point here, I think, though, has to be Mike Evans, who had 11 targets, 9 receptions, 159 and 2 touchdowns. One of those being a 57-yard reception. He catches it kind of in a almost contested catch situation, but the defender doesn't get there. He gets the reception. He turns around and he's off to the end zone. That sealed it pretty late in this. We get an early touchdown to Jalen McMillan, who had 6 targets, 5 receptions, 75 and a touchdown. That is a situation now where he has had 3 touchdowns in those last 2 games. We talked about it last week about what would it mean going forward. He's certainly earned himself more of a role in this offense. Cade Otton kind of fading a little bit to the background. He just had the 3 targets in this. Rashad White had a receiving touchdown, just the 2 targets, 2 receptions for 17 yards. McMillan, though, is looking pretty interesting here as we head into the kind of playoff portion of the season with what he has been able to do. But the Buccaneers are riding into a team that's going to be quite interesting as well.
Well, we talked about the potential for the Patriots to give Jalen Polk some more run in a lost season. Almost from that, what could it hurt perspective. Now, again, if your players aren't being accountable, which was one of the problems with Polk and something that seemed to dog him going back to college, then it undermines the type of franchise that you want to have if you're playing those guys anyway. But we're still in the portion of the campaign, which for rookies basically is just the whole year, where you're going to see the light go on. You're going to see the situation really flip for some of these young players. And Jalen McMillan over the last couple of weeks has been one of the greatest examples of that. We see someone like Xavier Worthy, whom we just talked about, where because of the first round draft pick selection, even when he starts to emerge, there can still be this perception of disappointment in him. Someone like McMillan, he's not saddled with those expectations. And so once he starts to put up dynamic plays, score touchdowns like he's been doing, provide a complement for them to Mike Evans, it's a game-changing deal for them. Evans, what can you say, right? He continues to put up these massive games. Baker Mayfield is basically Jameis Winston, but successful. Someone who doesn't make quite as many mistakes, someone who is down the field throwing his body around. It looks to me like the Buccaneers are going to be the team that comes out of this NFC South. And Mayfield was putting himself in some tough situations in terms of the risk of injury late in this game where they have the game won. You kind of want him to pull back a little bit there. If you have him, if you have Irving, if you have Evans, if you have McMillan, if you are a Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan, and yet that's not the way he plays. And
there's only one setting, Shawn. There's no, you can't change the settings. They're factory default.
So Mayfield, again, he's not going to win the NFL MVP, obviously, but I think he deserves to be at the back maybe of that top 5 with some of the things that he has done and just how hard he has played. He's basically, this has to be an exaggeration, but it feels like he's a foot shorter, much less athletic version of Josh Allen, who is still otherwise making a lot of Josh Allen types of plays. Mayfield's been in the NFL for a long time. Colm, you and I had that very frustrating Monday Night Football result several years ago where we just needed a few more passes to Jarvis Landry, and Baker Mayfield couldn't see the defensive line. Every pass was into a lineman's hands. He appears to be beyond that, right? He looks so good out there right now. One of the things that he's got going for them is he's playing a Los Angeles Chargers defense that isn't particularly good. Now, the interesting thing here is they're especially bad in run defense. This was a great matchup for White, a great matchup for Bucky Irving. They've been more successful against the passing game, but certainly they get scorched in this one. This was a game to give you a little bit of sense maybe of what the Chargers are, because they still are fighting for the playoff spot, certainly playoff positioning. They're facing a Buccaneers team in the same basic situation. The Chargers came in 8-5, but they had 8 wins against bad teams. They had 5 losses against good teams. One of the things that you see immediately from Jim Harbaugh is competency. This is a Chargers team that doesn't make a lot of mistakes, but is probably one of the weakest teams in the entire NFL from a talent perspective. Now, if you don't make a lot of mistakes, if you have a fantastic coaching staff, and you have Justin Herbert, then when you go out there against teams that are similar but make mistakes, then you tend to win. You go up against some of these teams that are simply more talented, and the Chargers right now don't have the firepower to deal with them. Like I said, not a very talented defense, and when you have to rely on Gus Edwards and Kamani Vidal to run the ball, when Ladd McConkey, who again is obviously pretty injured, he basically has all of his points in the first quarter. The Buccaneers are able to take him away after that. Quentin Johnston does his normal thing where he is actually scoring fantasy points, but catches only half of his 10 targets. The coaching staff has gone out of their way to point out that DJ Chark doesn't play much because he's not as good as McConkey, Quentin Johnston, and Joshua Palmer. Obviously, that's not a great sign for him. The Chargers have some very bright days in their future. Their organization at this point is in fantastic shape, but it's going to take them some time to simply add the personnel, add the talent that you need to have to be competitive against good NFL teams.
Last note in that game, Shawn, Mike Evans looking for another 1,000-yard season. He's now 251 yards away from that. You talked about bad defenses. They get the Cowboys, the Panthers, and the Saints to close the season out. So I think he is a shot at getting those 250 yards over those last couple of games after having this big performance in Week 15. Last game, Shawn, New Orleans Saints, Washington Commanders. This game felt like it was going to be very easy win for the Commanders as they are 14-0 up at the half. It ends up being just a 1-point victory for them when the Saints also go for the 2 after getting the touchdown to try and get the win. Spencer Rattler comes in and plays the majority of this game after Jake Hayner had started, and he was 4 of 10 for 49 yards and 1 interception, 3 sacks for 29 yards. Rattler came in, didn't have any sacks, no interceptions, just the 1 touchdown. They'll come in there, as I mentioned, at the very end of the game. He was 10 of 21 for 135. One of the most fun play, Shawn, in this game was a Cedric Wilson Jr. touchdown pass to Alvin Kamara, which I thought was a lot of fun, but it led to looks to be a groin injury for Alvin Kamara at the time of recording. The long-term status unknown, but he left the game after that particular point in the fourth quarter. Shawn, the other thing I was going to highlight is I give Zach Ertz a lot of criticisms over the years. He had a tremendous one-handed red zone catch on third down, but he did suffer a concussion then on that particular play. It led to Terry McLaurin's second touchdown off the game. So in the end was huge for the Commanders winning this one. They started very hot. They looked great. I don't know if it was a case of they felt comfortable with how the game was going, but they almost got caught in that second half, particularly in the fourth quarter, as they were kind of trying to see this one out. They're 9-5 on the season. Jayden Daniels was back rushing the ball a little bit more in this, 11 carries for 66 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 226 in the air. Terry McLaurin, I mentioned, had 2 touchdowns, 10 targets, 7 receptions for 76. Nothing else of huge note across the board then for the Commanders here in this game. Much to take away from this one?
Well, you want the Commanders to show a little bit more of a killer instinct, but a little bit of what's happening here is simply that their kicker carousel, the injuries they've suffered at that position, have made it a little bit more challenging for them to manage some of the tactics. We get a Greg Joseph miss that would have more or less sealed the game right before the Saints go down and score to tie, or in this case, to try and win, which they're not able to accomplish. Basically, all of the elements for a Jayden Daniels explosion were in place here. He looks really good running the ball. He has the 66 rushing yards. He leads the team in that category. If you're playing Daniels and not playing someone like Brian Robinson, you could take a big sigh of relief there. If you're playing Daniels and Terry McLaurin together, you come out of this game just feeling, what might have been. Now, McLaurin with the 773 and 2, to an extent, you can't be too frustrated with that. But if you're trying to win the million, then you saw, maybe your best opportunity go by the wayside. There were 3 separate vertical passes to McLaurin that should have been touchdowns. The first one, he's wide open behind the defense, and Jayden Daniels just barely overthrows him. Those are the types of plays that we've gotten all season from Patrick Mahomes and Xavier Worthy. Those plays do happen. But then they come back a little bit later, and McLaurin is again behind the defense. Jayden Daniels hits him perfectly in stride, and McLaurin manages to sort of triple bobble the ball all the way down. You continue to think he's going to actually pull that in and go in for the touchdown, but he doesn't in the end. And then a little bit later, McLaurin gets wide open behind the defense for the 3rd time. And on that one, Daniel's like, well, I overthrew him. I threw it right to him. I'm going to make this one extremely safe. He puts it up there very softly. The ball does get there, but the defender gets there more or less at the same time. That ball gets knocked away. Terry McLaurin could have had, something like 10 catches for 250 yards and 4 scores in this game. That would have been a better line.
It would have been a monster line, Shawn. It also would have helped Jayden Daniels, but McLaurin has looked really good. They have had a super solid connection over the second half of the season, which has been pretty awesome to see. That is where we're closing it out here for the NFL Week 15 review. Shawn, any final thoughts on 15 before we get into Week 16? You mentioned the playoffs during this show. It's right around the corner. I actually looked this up, I think, 2 weeks ago. Obviously, they've changed the Super Bowl date 1 week longer with the extended season. It hasn't happened yet, but Shawn, this year it will happen. It used to always be the week before my birthday would be the Super Bowl. Super Bowl this year on my timeline, what the time difference will be, the 9th of February. So we're looking ahead to a Packers Super Bowl win. I think that's what's in the stars.
So Colm here, Packers. Who did the Packers defeat in the Super Bowl?
Doesn't matter, Shawn.
It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I do like that call because you're right. The Packers win. It will not matter. I'm going to take.
If I had to call now, I think
I always take, which is Lions over Chiefs.
Yeah. I think Packers over Bills, but I don't know. There's no way we keep up with the Bills in the Super Bowl race if we're kicking field goals on 4th and 2 from the 5-yard line.
Well, don't you think it's most likely that we get Ravens Bills in the AFC semifinals and Lamar Jackson goes for 500 yards from scrimmage, the Ravens win in a blowout, and then they go to Kansas City in the AFC Championship game, and you just get the normal AFC Championship game result from Lamar Jackson? I mean, that's probably not true. The Ravens and the Bills have been extremely exciting. One of those teams will probably come through this year. So I think your Packers have some work to do if they want to compete with the true heavyweights, but they're right there. Their defense is so good. Colm, my biggest takeaway from week 15 is that we dodged those massive games from the backs who have made all the difference this year. You dodged the Saquon Barkley game. You dodged the Joe Mixon game. Players like Josh Jacobs and Alvin Kamara scored okay, but certainly, you mentioned that catch from Kamara. That was one of the great catches. That Commanders-Saints game probably had the two best catches of the weekend. Now, there are a couple of games that I haven't seen. Colm, you destroyed my Monday morning when you came in. And, I worked through as many of these games as I can. Last night I was up until 2 a.m. watching them. Then I try and preserve sort of the spoiler element until after I'm able to. I'll get through them a little bit later on Monday. The DeVonta Adams performance, certainly frustrating. To have dodged these big running back games, but then to have the elite QBs and some of the, in some cases, deserved receivers scoring, in some cases, receivers who managed to bellyache their way out of a certain franchise and then play poorly with another, only to feast on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, Colin, this is why we've been playing people against the Jaguars. Will Levis is like, the Jaguars are still an NFL team. What are you talking about? So some things there that you lament, but also it speaks to how much fun and how dynamic fantasy football is, that you get into the sprint, you get into your league playoffs, anything can happen. A lot of our guys still had very, very good weeks, if not the mega scores that maybe you need to keep up with a player like an Adams, an Amon-Ra, a Mike Evans. Those are tough scores to match, certainly if they're also paired with someone like a Josh Allen. But there are 2 more weeks to go. In many cases, you weren't facing those players and you are on through. We're excited for all the listeners who are into the best ball semifinals, into their redraft semifinals. Good luck to everybody as we go forward here. Colm, you and I had a great week. I'm excited to see what comes next.
Yeah, and Shawn did mention there the Jets. A couple of things to close it out, Shawn. Alvin Kamara, the 4th player in NFL history with that reception that we were talking about there, to have 50 or more rushing touchdowns and 25 or more receiving touchdowns. So I think, in very high grade company when it comes to numbers like that. Shawn, I know the DeVonta Adams Jets thing, you'll catch up on it later. DeVonta Adams had some all-time, this was an all-time performance by him. I mentioned this to you before the show, but 0 receptions on 2 targets at halftime, finishes the game with 198 yards and 2 touchdowns in the second half. Some of old school receptions has almost one, I think, Shawn, that will rival Puka's reception from last week in that second half on the lead up to the Breece Hall rushing touchdown. And the other thing, he did hit 100 receiving touchdowns in this game, 80 of those coming from Aaron Rodgers. So I have a very big soft spot for DeVonta Adams, much softer than Shawn has. But
well, certainly congratulations to him on those career numbers. That's fantastic work. And I remember when DeVonta Adams came into the league, writing about him for RotoViz, talking about how he was going to be a star, how he was the guy that you had to have on all of your dynasty teams, how he was vastly underrated as a prospect. It really took keeping the faith through those first couple of years. But since then, I mean, Adams has been on an extended stretch of brilliance that only a handful of players in NFL history can rival. DeVonta Adams, one of the all-time greats.
Yeah, I think he's destined for the Hall of Fame, but that was a big performance. We'll see what happens over the course of the next couple of weeks from the Jets. I think this may have just been the Jaguars. But that is going to close us out here. We will be back with our Friday show, so stay tuned for that one. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.